Thanks everyone for coming. It's really nice to be back in person again after a bit of a break over the summer. Tonight we've got a talk from Emily Dowd, who is a PhD student here in ICAS. So I think we can get started with the talk. So I'll just welcome Emily. Emily is a third-year PhD student at the University of Leeds. Her research is focused on investigating local and global methane sources using satellites. She has an MPhil in physics with meteorology from the University of Edinburgh and worked as an offshore meteorologist in Aberdeen for 2 years before starting her PhD. She's also co-founder of an Earth observation outreach programme called Sat School, which is starting to take into schools across the UK to highlight STEM pathways. Outside of work, she loves everything outdoors, various activities depending on the weather. So over to you, Emily. Not that one. There you go.
So, hello everyone. It's nice to see so many faces tonight. I'm a PhD student here at University of Leeds, and today I'm going to talk about my journey from being a meteorologist to a methane researcher. So, just to kind of give a quick summary of what you'll hear today, I'm just going to talk about my journey, why I still chose to study science as a kid, and then kind of what I did as an education and my time as a meteorology, and why I chose to move from industry into research. And then I'll kind of give a quick overview of my current PhD research in methane, and I'll give you a quick summary of that outreach project that Sarah mentioned as well, because it's quite exciting. So to start off, why do I like meteorology? It might be a bit of a silly question because everyone here loves meteorology, but it kind of started off from a young age. I had a role model in the house when I was growing up. My dad was working doing a science degree with the Open University, so it was quite often doing really random experiments in the house. So, for example, he would be trying to measure the distance between the Earth and the Moon using a household broom. And he would also be answering my really daft questions like, why is the sea salty? I was quite curious from a young age, and then I think that stemmed from traveling as well. I was really fortunate to go on holiday to the US, and I kind of first experienced the first ever large thunderstorm ever in my life, and I was quite shocked by it, and I was like, what processes go on in the atmosphere that cause a thunderstorm? And that kind of led me to think, what jobs could you do where you could look at weather? So that was meteorology and becoming a meteorologist. So I worked really hard at school and went on to do a degree at the University of Edinburgh, where I did physics with meteorology. And it was a 5 years degree, and in my final year I ended up doing a project in methane with the title Understanding Recent Trends in Atmospheric Methane. So it doesn't sound like a very exciting title, but I'll kind of circle round to background to that later and tell you why I find methane so interesting. So going back to meteorology, I was obviously aiming to become a meteorologist, so I did a lot of work experience. So I did a couple of weeks work at RAF Bottymouth up in Scotland, where I did 2 weeks work experience, where I helped take weather forecasts and shadowed a forecaster, and also attended weather briefings where they briefed the squadron leaders on what the weather was going to be like for their missions that day. And then I also did 1 week's worth of experience at the Edinburgh office, where again I did weather observations and also learned about the quality control of the data that they collect within the Met Office. So after I graduated, I managed to get a job as an offshore meteorologist up in Aberdeen at a company called Meteor Group. I managed to reach my lifelong goal of becoming a meteorologist. It was a great feeling. And Meteor Group provide weather forecasts for a lot of different customers all across the world. And these customers include companies that deal with oil rigs and offshore platforms, but also large vessels and also salvage companies as well. So you're kind of wondering what it might be like to be a weather forecaster and to forecast for these different types of companies. So I'm going to kind of give you a quick run through of what it's like to do a shift as a weather forecaster at Meteor Group. So if you're on the day shift, you start off quite early. You could start at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. and you start the day off by doing a handover with the person who's coming off night shift to try and figure out if there was any issues during the night or any important weather events that might be coming up in the forecast that you need to know of. And then we also had to update the vessel locations because we might have ships that are on routes and we need to make sure that we know where they are to give them an accurate weather forecast. And then we also had to look at the synoptic situation to make sure we had an idea of what was going on over the next 3 to 5 days. And then the big job is updating the weather forecast. So we have a lot of different customers dotted around the globe, and we had to update each individual location of each individual location for each forecast for the customer. So to start off, we would check the weather observations and edit the forecast to the observations, and then we would check the different types of weather models that are out there and see which ones were more confident, and then we would kind of make changes to the forecast depending on the confidence of the forecast. And then we would also correct for local conditions. For example, if the location of the forecast was in a channel and the wind was blowing a certain way, then you would have to adjust for that because not all models capture those local conditions. And then whilst you're also updating the weather forecast, you also have to monitor squalls and lightning. So here in the Gulf of Guinea, you can have a lot of lightning and thunderstorms, and these can move offshore. So we have to give updates to our customers on whether how these the thunderstorms are progressing and if they're moving towards them or not. And also we monitor tropical cyclones as well, so we give them regular updates on how that's progressing too. And if that wasn't enough, you also had to answer phone calls and emails from customers, and we also have 4 updates of the model each day. So within the day shift, we also had to repeat that all again and keep to time because our forecasts were scheduled, so we had to make sure that we were keeping an eye on time. So that's kind of a flavour of what it's like to be an offshore forecaster. And during my time at Meteor Group, there was a few interesting events that happened while I was forecasting there. And these are mostly salvage operations, so just to highlight a few. One of them was called Key Trader, and this ran aground in the Pacific Ocean. And it took about 2 years to salvage, and it was split in half after being hit by 2 cyclones. And then we also had the MV Wakashio, which ran aground in Mauritius, and it leaked about 100 tons of oil into the ocean, and it was also a marine protected area, so it did quite have an environmental impact. And similarly, the North Guider also ran aground in Svalbard, and this was quite a tricky location to recover the vessel because of sea ice and due to local wildlife as well. So we did forecasts for the salvage company that tried to salvage these vessels. So after about 2 years as a meteorologist, I was starting to look for something new. I kind of wanted to expand my knowledge on the atmosphere more, and I wanted to do more project-based work and kind of working with groups of people collaboratively, because that's something that I quite enjoy doing. So I started looking for other opportunities, and this opportunity came up with the CENT CDT, which is an Earth Observation Centre for Doctoral Training. And the project that came up was called Investigating Local and Global Trends in Atmospheric Methane. And this is quite similar to what my master's project title was. And when I read the project description, I was like, this project was written for me. It sounds great. And the great thing about this project was that we also got some training in Earth observation. So we've learned lots about different types of Earth observation techniques and machine learning techniques on top of using the satellite that I use for my own research as well. And also there's a whole network of other PhD students on this programme across the UK, so it's great to see what other people are doing in Earth observation too. So my PhD project is focused on using satellites and a chemical transport model to investigate changes in atmospheric methane. So why is methane important? Methane is the second most important anthropogenic greenhouse gas in our atmosphere after carbon dioxide, and anthropogenic emissions have contributed an extra 23% of the radiative forcing in the troposphere since 1750. But the problem is that global variations of methane are poorly understood. For example, this figure here just shows the global monthly mean concentrations of methane, and from the 80s, methane concentrations were rising, but then around 1999, the global concentrations kind of stopped increasing for about 6 years, and currently scientists don't fully understand why that stopped, why methane stopped growing, and then we also are not 100% sure why it started to grow again in 2007. And then similarly, methane growth rate accelerated in 2014, and also recently in 2020 and 2021, we had the largest global annual increases of methane on record. So the methane trends are still not fully understood, which is why I think methane is super interesting. And the reason these variations are poorly understood is due to uncertainties in the drivers of the sources and sinks of methane. So methane has a mixture of natural and anthropogenic sources, and the largest natural source of methane are wetlands, but it also has other major sources including agriculture and waste, fossil fuels, and biomass burning. Methane's main sink is the OH radical, but it can also be removed by other chemical reactions in the atmosphere, or it can be taken up by the soil as well. So another reason why we struggle to fully understand what is going on with methane is due to the observations that we have. So starting with the surface observation network, which is mostly done by NOAA, you can see in this figure here on the left that the blue dots just show the surface observations that we currently have across the world. And you can see that it's quite sparse, and there's a disproportionate number of observations in the northern hemisphere when compared to the southern hemisphere. So there is a bit of a gap in our knowledge, particularly in regions in the tropics where there are large and variable sources of methane, and this is where wetlands often are. The good thing about these surface observations is that they are long term, but the problem is that the observations are not always regular as well. So there's some pros and cons to the surface network. But then we start looking at satellite observations, which can give us a bird's eye view of the Earth, and looking at the GOSAT satellite. So this is an improvement on the NOAA surface observations. This GOSAT satellite was launched in 2009 and has a pixel size of 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers on the ground, and it provides global coverage of methane every 3 days. So you can see it is an improvement, but there still is some gaps in the data there. But then more recently in 2017, Sentinel-5P was launched with an instrument on it called TROPOME, and this has a ground pixel of 3.5 kilometers by 7 kilometers, and it provides near global coverage of methane measurements every day. And you can see this is a massive improvement compared to the GOSAT satellite. And this is allowing us to view methane in a way that hasn't ever been done so before, which is very exciting. Another tool that we can use to investigate changes in methane in the atmosphere is using a chemical transport model, and the one that I use is called TOMCAT, and it can simulate up to 70 chemical species in the atmosphere with around 220 chemical reactions. But the version of this model that I use is a more simplified version because the chemistry in methane is quite simple, and that means it's quicker to run. And the resolution of this model can be run at around 2.8 by 2.8 degrees, but can go up to around 1 by 1 degree resolution. So recently I've been investigating the large rise of atmospheric methane in 2020. As I said earlier, that in 2020 and in 2021 we have observed the largest global annual increases on record. So I'm just going to kind of show you some recent work that I've been doing where I've compared the TROPOME satellite data with the chemical transport model called TOMCAT. And in TOMCAT, we've used surface emissions, which are a best estimate, which have taken into account the surface observation network. So to start off, I just did a simple comparison between the satellite TROPOME and the chemical transport model TOMCAT. This figure on the top shows the TROPOME annual mean total column methane concentrations, And you can see that the total column is increasing over time from 2018 to 2020. And there's areas of high methane over Africa, India, and also China. And then we know that Tomcat captures the surface methane well due to the assimilation of the surface observations. But you can see when you compare the Tomcat with the Tropomi that Tomcat is overestimating when compared with the satellite. But it still shows similar areas of high methane that the satellite shows, which is quite good. So I made some corrections for this bias, and then to ensure that I captured the global annual increase in 2020, I compared the global monthly mean concentrations of Tomcat and Tropomi, where Tomcat is in blue and Tropomi is in black. And you can see that Tomcat captures the seasonal cycle well when compared with the satellite. And when I calculated the global annual increase, I found that in the satellite, the annual increase was 14.9 parts per billion, and Tomcat was 15.8 ppb. And these values are comparable to what was observed by the surface network in NOAA, which was 15.3 ppb, which is good news. So what might be driving this large increase in 2020? So in order to look at this, I calculated the 2020 annual increase relative to the global mean annual increase. And this is just try and pinpoint areas of high growth rate compared to the global mean growth rate. And you can see from this figure here that the largest relative increases happen in the Northern Hemisphere, but regions stand out such as South Sudan and Uganda, Russia, and also Canada as well. So I'm going to quickly show you some more information on South Sudan, as it's quite an interesting area at the moment. And we can just see here on this figure in the bottom right, just a time series of the methane concentrations over South Sudan with the satellite in black and the model in blue. And you can see that Tropomi shows large increases in methane in the September, October, November season in both 2019 and 2020. But you can see that there's a mismatch in the seasonal cycle between the model and the satellite. And previous studies have shown that that wet charts, which is the model that we used in our chemical transport model, that it doesn't capture the seasonal cycle very well, and this is due to the wet charts model relying on local precipitation instead that the Sud wetlands are reliant on river inflow from the White Nile, so there's some mismatches in information in this model. And then also another study showed that in 2019 that there was a large amount of rainfall which was related to high methane concentrations in this region, and these large rain seasons continued into 2020. So it's likely that wetlands are driving this large increase in this region. And then similarly, looking at the other regions, you can see from the locations in 2020 where the high methane concentrations are, that these are locations where wetlands are generally situated, and so it's possible that wetlands are driving this large increase in these two regions, in Uganda and Canada. And then looking over to Russia, we know that 2019 and 2020 was quite large wildfire seasons in Russia, so it's likely that these could be a contributing factor to the large increase in methane in this region for 2020. So just to kind of give a quick summary of my research and my project, I use satellites and computer models to investigate atmospheric methane, and have been recently looking at the large rise of methane in 2020. And I found that the model and the satellite are comparable to the surface observations for the annual increase, and we found regions of large increases over South Sudan, Uganda, Canada, and Russia. And then from these selected regions, it seems that wetlands are a large contributor to the large rise in methane in 2020. But more work is needed to untangle this whole story, so I plan to develop a nested grid model for Tomcat in order to do high resolution comparisons with Tropomi. And a nested grid model is where you can select an area of interest and model that at high resolution, but then the rest of the world is run at a coarser resolution, so it's not as computationally expensive. So that's the plan for the next steps of this study. And then just to kind of finish off, I'm going to talk about SAT School, which is an outreach project that I'm involved in and helped co-found. If anyone's interested in doing outreach in schools or know anyone that might want to be an Earth observation ambassador, basically SAT School is an outreach project which contains 12 plus hours of resources to introduce key concepts of Earth observation, and it's aimed at 11 to 15-year-olds, but it can be used for anyone above that age range. And teachers can also request an EO ambassador to come into school, but if you also want to be an Earth observation ambassador, you can talk to me afterwards and we can give you more information on that. But if you also want to find out more about Earth observations yourself, the resources are self-led, so you can head to this website and check them out as well. And that's all for me.
Excellent. Thank you very much. If anyone online has any questions, you should have access to a Q&A, so feel free to type them in there and Ben will read them out for us. But does anyone have any questions in the room to get started? Yeah.
I was interested in the first part of your discussion there, when you said you have customers all over the world and you keep up to date all the time. When you thought pre-shipwreck, did they not get a forecast or did they ignore it?
Well, I don't actually know how they ran aground.
The first one was hit by 2 tornadoes, you said. I mean, it must have been got to sleep when the forecast came in.
Well, yeah, it's possible. Yeah, so the ships that ran aground, I'm not sure if we actually forecasted for. Those were just the ones that we specifically did for salvage companies who were cleaning up the wreckage. And yeah, the cyclones hit that vessel when it was already ran aground, and that's why it split in half.
It must have been a bit awkward for the captain if he'd been given a forecast and he ignored it and looked back and that's all.
Yeah, yeah.
For the slowdown in methane emissions in the early 2000s, are there some like leading hypotheses for why that happened, and do you have one that you believe more than another one?
Yeah.
Sorry, what was the question?
It was about the stagnation and growth of methane and whether there's a hypothesis or leading hypothesis on it. So I think the thing is with the lack of surface observations or observations makes it really difficult for anyone to draw any conclusions. So basically the papers that have looked at this have been saying it's either emissions or the sinks or a mixture of both. So it's very uncertain. Yeah, I think the one thing that's difficult about the sinks is that OH is lifetime is on an order of a second, so it's really difficult to measure directly. So it adds a really big uncertainty in like modelling, particularly because you have to come up with an estimate of it, and quite often models assume that they vary within the year, but you keep them constant from year to year. So yeah, that's maybe one thing that's not included in the models that could be.
Thanks.
Dave?
Have you noticed a significant increase in methane emissions linked up with all the melting of the tundra? We're just been watching the frozen planet, some of the amazing footage of the tundra melting and the land just collapsing and just methane pouring out of everywhere. I'd have thought you'd have some hot spots up in the Arctic, you know, in Russia, Siberia, and these areas.
Yeah, so there's one thing that I'm planning to look at next in this study, specifically looking at 2020 over Siberia, because yeah, Russia was one of the regions that had a high increase, but it's quite difficult to measure using satellites. So I'll need to go and look at more like climatological variables. But as your question is to like maybe why it's not coming up, it could be like more of a diffuse source, so it could be might not be detected by the satellite or straight away. It depends.
Not yet, but I'm sure we will. Yeah.
We'll just see if there's any more online questions.
We do have an online question. So Will B says, in your future research, is there a possibility of trying to see trends between teleconnection systems, ENSO, MJO, etc., to the increases or stagnation of methane concentrations?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a really good question. So we know that carbon dioxide does seem to vary with El Nino oscillations, But the thing is, there doesn't seem to be a strong correlation with methane, which kind of adds to the complexity of the methane problem. So yeah, I think one of the things with wetlands is we don't really understand how it responds to changes in climate. So and then emits methane. So like 1 year it could be really wet and warm and it could emit a lot of methane, but the next year it could be wet and maybe emit more methane. So we don't know how wetlands are responding to the changes in climate.
Is the methane vertical structure mostly tropospheric, or does it go up in the stratosphere and mesosphere?
It's mostly in the troposphere, but it does get transported further up.
Do you know how much of proportion on that timescale?
No, I don't.
Okay.
But with the satellite measurement, it's like total column measurement, so we don't have any information on like the vertical profile. There might be measurements that do that, but I've not looked at them.
I have a follow-on question from that that's related. Yeah, how valuable would it be to have like everyday profiles vertically of methane? Talking about the lowest, like 2 kilometers for drones specifically.
Yeah,
you might have some drones to.
Yeah, we might be able to do that.
Yeah.
Some more.
I think it would be really valuable to take measurements over wetlands, because that's an area that's quite inaccessible. They're also in countries that are quite difficult to get to, and I think having information across a whole wetland would be really valuable in that sense.
Good to know.
Could you explain more about methane sinks, what they do, what they are, and how they influence the actual amount of methane in the atmosphere?
Yep. So the main sink of methane is a hydroxyl radical, and that is created by basically light reacting with it in the atmosphere, and then it reacts with methane and destroys it completely. And the OH lifetime is the order of a second, but methane can last in the atmosphere for approximately 9 years. And the OH, because it is dependent on light, it is seasonal variation, but then also it varies latitudinally as well. And it just reacts with it and completely destroys it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Kind of.
What else would you like to know?
I thought sinks were actually a physical thing which absorbed it, and then released it later, like wetlands.
So wetlands are a source of methane, because basically the matter anaerobically decomposes and releases methane into the atmosphere. But then sinks are just something that removes methane from the atmosphere, so it could be through a chemical reaction or uptake in soils. But I don't know the actual mechanism of how it is uptaken by soils.
Do we have any more online questions? Okay, Dave.
I'm just wondering how significant are is the methane that's been lost through the blowing up of the gas pipe in the Baltic? There seems to be a heck of a lot of gas being released.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting topic, and a lot of scientists are trying to quantify how much methane has been released from this leak or explosion. I think on a global scale, it is a large leak, but on a global scale there are larger emitters at play as well, so it might ultimately have a small impact overall, but we don't want these things to be happening anyway. So
I mean, would it be better? I know it sounds awful, but to ignite it, would it generate less greenhouse gases, or just allow it to?
Yeah, I don't know.
No.
I think they tried that before, and it just kept burning for. It's just still going. They set fire to something methane source, and it's still burning.
So they can't put it out?
No.
Oh, right.
So maybe, yeah.
That one was
I can't remember where that is, but it's definitely somewhere where it's just been burning for a really long time. So it might not be ideal to do that.
No, because it'd be
I'm not an
quite a
expert.
big flame, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
For the size of methane, how does that work? You said that for the size, it could be And they work with
Yeah. So so it comes from biomass burning, so incomplete combustion. Methane is released when things are going through incomplete combustion.
Cool. That was a good interrogation. I think we can leave it there unless anyone has any more questions or if there's any more online. Which I don't think there are. So thanks again. That was a great talk and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any more questions, I'm sure I'm going to be happy to answer them at some point. We don't have a talk in November, but we're just finalising dates for December, January and February. So if you keep an eye on our emails and social media, hopefully we'll see you again at the next talk. Thanks again. And thanks also to everyone that joined online. I hope you can't communicate with us, but thanks.